Hi everyone, this is Melissa Wright with Local First Arizona. I'm super excited to be here with LaQuaya Shelton, the founder and chief executive officer of Revolutionary HR Consulting. And so before I pass it on over to her, I'm just going to go over a few bits and pieces. If you've been in the webinars before, you know how this goes. But just remember that whenever you joined the webinar, you are automatically on mute. So if you could go ahead and just keep yourself on mute, it helps since we are recording all the webinars and posting them later on YouTube. It just makes sure all the audio is cleaner and nicer for people to listen to at a later date. So LaQuaya will be taking questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to drop your questions into the chat box throughout the presentation, and I will be asking them at the end. So you can go ahead and just go to the bottom of your screen and click on the little chat icon, and that'll bring up that section. If you also have a technical question, if something's not working for you, you could also drop it in that area, and I'll be keeping an eye on that as well. So that's about it for my deal. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it on over to LaQuaya. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, you bet. My pleasure. Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Local First, and everything that you guys are doing there to help support the local business community and business community beyond Arizona. Even thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is LaQuaya Shelton. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Revolutionary HR Consulting, where we help organizations to align their business strategies with their talent management strategies. So we essentially take a look at what is happening in talent management, compare it to what you need to create the talent management strategies that you need. So thank you so much for choosing to spend your afternoon or your lunch hour with us, because I know there are so many other things that you could be doing and dedicating your time to. So again, thank you for choosing to spend it here with us. And today we're going to talk about returning to work and yet not returning to normal. Because most, if not all of us, are dealing with one of these three major issues, which I've affectionately started referring to as the workforce or the workplace trifecta. And there's no way around that. As much as we'd like to separate these into neat individual projects, those are just not the times that we're living in. We can't assume that how we lead and develop people is or will be the same as we move into the future, because this is anything but business as usual. We know that economies are shifting. We are shifting from an age of production to an age of imagination. And today, success increasingly depends on innovation and entrepreneurship and other forms of creativity that rely not just on skills, but on those less quantifiable capabilities, those essential skills like critical thinking and emotional intelligence, innovation, entrepreneurship, and social intelligence and collaboration. So the good news is that many of these things that are happening now, we've been discussing and projecting to occur over the next 3 to 5 years, roughly. But we've been projecting it for a long time. So while we prefer something other than having to drink from a fire hose, or have the fire hose crammed down our throats to drink from it, we're at least armed with good data and a baseline familiarity with these about these concepts, what used to be futuristic concepts that are here now. So we've known that we would see a shift to more virtual work. We've known that we would see an increased use of technology, an increased demand for essential skills, and those things, that I mentioned again, often referred to as soft skills, but they are essential skills. Which, side note, I object to the term soft skills, because things like innovation and emotional intelligence, critical thinking are anything but soft. They are not soft. Those are essential skills. But we have strived for a long time as well to improve diversity and inclusion, and often we barely move the needle, if at all. So there is some silver lining, in other words, to having to accelerate the progress and rapidly respond to this changed landscape that we're now in. So setting the stage for returning to work, whether it's full-time, part-time, or hybrid model where you've got a mix of some in the office, still working from home, we're moving out of this immediate response mode into recovery mode. And while we were in immediate response mode, many organizations, we gave up traditional processes and bureaucracies, and we replaced them for solving for faster outcomes. Our priorities became clearer. We gained a laser sharp focus on what needed to get done in the very short time frame that we had, as many organizations really went into survival mode. And now we've started to emerge from that with some significant directional changes. Because throughout this time of uncertainty, we've seen a super acceleration in changing expectations across different groups, consumer groups, our workers, or leaders, and organizations are being called to respond to these workforce changes by redesigning the way that we think about and that we engage talent, really focusing on capacity and cost, connectivity and capability, compliance and change, frankly. And so in doing so, businesses really need to form a cogent strategy for this transition, knowing that the recovery will likely not be linear. It'll be filled with setbacks and starts and stops, but being agile, being inventive and open to changing practices will best equip us, your organization, to serve your customers and your stakeholders, because their needs are evolving, their behaviors, their attitudes, their expectations are changing as well. So for the discussion today, we're going to focus on these three primary areas: managing employees returning to the workplace, updating policies and procedures, and prioritizing diversity in your workforce. And while these are each big pieces of work, there are common themes and threads throughout each of the areas that when you identify them, they really help to advance all three while not exhausting yourself and your resources any further than they already are. So we'll look at things on a more macro level first, and then a bit more tactical, and then we'll conclude with some final things for consideration to help you cultivate and execute your plans. A general disclaimer, just as we focus on these, we just will really be able to scratch the surface on a lot of these because they're big topics. So if there's interest later, we can certainly do additional webinars that deep dive into these areas. The big common thread everyone is experiencing, that we're all living through, are the same catastrophic events. Now, how it affects each one of us individually differs, but it's without question that the pandemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism have impacted our lives and the lives of our employees greatly. The impacts of those pandemics carry over into the workplace. And so now is really that time, as you reimagine the post-pandemic organization, pay careful attention to the effect that your choices have on your organizational norms, on your culture, and focus on those ties that bind your people together. In order to start getting our arms around the big three, the kind of juggernauts as we described them, we need to first recognize the common effects these forces have on people and on our people, because this will help us define synergies, which will lead us to the mindset or the outlook that's necessary to really do this work most effectively. The issues are not separate and distinct, but rather they're all on a continuum of the 2020 employment experience. So when you begin to build the process for employees returning to work, you really want to take into consideration that employees are facing a universal set of challenges that we just talked about, with the impact being to health and equality and economic uncertainty. They're all common issues for employees, and it has an impact on employees' outlook. So this mix of uncertainty in critical areas of life may be causing your employees to re-examine social circumstances and their careers, and even question things that they've enjoyed fundamental clarity on prior to the pandemics. So things like the basic purpose of the employment relationship, their performance expectations, their career trajectory, their work priorities, the organization's priorities, things like that are brought into question. The line separating work and life has all but disappeared, and employees are increasingly stressed. So management teams should really look to lead with empathy and demonstrate an understanding that while all of their employees have experienced this crisis, they haven't experienced it the same way. Some have suffered from COVID or have lost loved ones. Others may be caregivers for the vulnerable population. Some are minorities whose communities have been disproportionately impacted, not just with regards to COVID, but in many other areas of life, including healthcare and education and employment, and those systems of oppression that have really been put under the spotlight. So whatever the effects are, because we're living with so much ambiguity, employees will benefit greatly, tremendously from clarity and compassion. So how your organization responds during this time will have lasting effects on your employees and your brand, quite frankly. So let's talk about now the journey back to work and the salient aspects of planning for that. In preparing for welcoming employees back to the workplace, you want to first analyze which roles transitioned smoothly to remote working, which ones did not, because this is going to help you inform, this is going to help inform decisions about when subsets of employees should be asked to return to the workplace. Because you have some employees in positions where VO has worked well, virtual office, and you have uh, and where it's not mission critical to bring them back in the office. So you may want to consider leaving them virtual office for a bit longer, or a hybrid model of having some in office, some virtual office, if that's financially feasible to maintain both. But plan for a range of scenarios.
Yeah, I'm booked from 12:30 to the end of the day, so I do need to take a break.
Plan for a range of scenarios. There's always one. Tim, you're the one today. That's right, I'm calling Tim out. Oh, we all do it. Let's just hope my dogs don't bark during this presentation, because it's like that's when they know to start barking, is when mommy is working. So again, plan for a range of scenarios based on where the mission critical work is taking place. As I mentioned, you may want to explore that hybrid model. Again, if it's feasible, you could have different intervals for bringing people back into the workplace. It might make sense to allow people in jobs who had little to no drop off in productivity to continue working remotely for an extended period of time, just to reduce the on-site headcount and lessen the risk to employee health. We had to respond quickly and pivot quickly in this in the shift to virtual office, and a lot of our mindsets as leaders perhaps weren't quite there in terms of how to most effectively manage people that you can't see every day. My point in mentioning is that is don't let that be the reason for bringing people back to the workplace. Again, if they're performing well, if you're able to sustain that, then perhaps consider leaving them in that capacity for a bit longer. Also make sure that employees understand what's being asked of them and what steps the company is taking to protect their health. Change management and communication strategies are going to be critical in helping employees come back and helping them embrace a shared vision of what comes next for the company, helping them to reacclimate to an on-site workforce is going to present an enormous change management challenge, frankly, for leaders. Leaders will need to make a communication strategy as just part of their change management to help employees who are returning to the workplace, as well as those who continue to work remotely. Again, helping them to embrace that shared vision of what comes next. Also, you want to make sure to work with your human resources teams, prepare for a potential uptick in ethics or compliance complaints, to address ongoing concerns. People, as I mentioned, everything affects people differently. How they handle things are different. You may disagree with someone in your personal life that's managed very differently than how that disagreement unfolds at work. So you want to, again, work with your HR leaders and your talent management leaders to effectively navigate that, and then be prepared to adjust employee experience strategies as well. So you may need to take even more things into a digital capacity or otherwise for, again, those experience strategies. So we know that at a, we know that at a more macro level, what and how the environmental forces that are affecting employees, that are affecting the employee population. We know now what those forces are. So to drill down a little bit further in a more practical sense, again, setting that stage for employees coming back, that should involve engaging with your employees to understand what their needs are, what has been working well, what hasn't been working well, so that you can address those matters proactively and get them resolved before they turn into bigger issues. Because without that employee buy-in, even with the best crafted plans, things are likely to run into trouble. So engage with employees to understand their needs, determine their outlook, identify what questions they have and what their expectations are about work priorities. Some employees will have conditions that increase the risk of infection and may be reluctant to return to the office, or reluctant for other reasons. Others might be eager to come back and leave remote work, but they may have caregiving responsibilities that make it difficult or impossible for them to do so right now. Whatever the case, the point is sensitivity to this reality is a must. Employees who feel it, not only is it the right thing to do, but it also translates to your bottom line. Because employees who feel supported by their employers, they feel more successful, valued, engaged, productive, respected. When they're not supported, those feelings drop significantly. Returning to work will likely require a mindset shift for those who've adjusted to working remotely. Businesses should be able to provide the appropriate support and resources to assist employees with making this shift successfully. Supporting employee mental health is a big part of this. It's critical to this end. And we're not simply talking about traditional wellness, but providing access to something like an employee assistance program or other programs that offer a holistic well-being assistance that really addresses those four key components of mental health, financial, social, and physical health. So mental health assistance is going to be essential for companies to help their employees navigate our current environment and support the organization's recovery. You'll want to consider whether and how you're going to shift performance goals, goal setting, evaluation criteria, employee evaluations, all of those. Start thinking through those if you haven't already and what that looks like. And then you want to enable real two-way communication. So opening up those channels to not just provide, but to receive information from employees. And by doing this, by enabling that real two-way communication, you're going to create opportunity to strengthen the company culture, to increase employee engagement, boost productivity and loyalty over the long run. Employees are really going to need clarity on what their priorities are and those of the company. So you may need a reset of the employment relationship. You may need to reset that by articulating what the expectations and future direction of the company is, what the organizational priorities are. Because with so much uncertainty and ambiguity in our world right now, people crave clarity and simplicity. So provide that whenever you can. Ensure that employees understand what's being asked of them and what steps the company is taking to protect their health. Clear policy statements are essential to that end. In the learning and development space, make sure that training is available to support employees in performing their jobs successfully and in learning new skills. View training as a critical area. to avoid eliminating it. Oftentimes we see the first couple of places to be downsized in an economic downturn is training. And that's really one of the places that you need to hold on to, at the very least, hold on to those resources or a portion of those resources, whether internal or invested externally, but so that you can invest in the capabilities, the individual and collective capabilities of your staff. So again, view that as a critical area. In a recent poll conducted by Gartner HR, which is actually listed, there's some resources at the end of this PowerPoint, just some links to resource information, and this is included. In their recent poll, it showed that 48% of employees will likely work remotely at least part of the time after COVID, versus 30% before the pandemic. And so this means that your employees, that they really need those critical competencies to collaborate digitally. As organizations continue to shift to more remote work operations or pulling them back, those competencies again are going to be necessary. So you want to explore what other critical competencies employees are going to need to collaborate in that environment, and to help them build those skills that the business projects it's going to need, that it projects it's going to need to be successful and to remain successful. In the space of leadership development, we don't want to forget about that. We remember to invest in your leaders. And not to overload their plates, because their roles are so impactful. And we already place so much responsibility with our leadership teams that we want to make sure that we are supporting them appropriately as well. They're people too. And we need to make sure that we support them in building the capacity to help support their employees during this time. So, when companies enthusiastically support their employees, or those companies, I should say, that enthusiastically support their employees, they will fare better in the long run, short term and the long run, frankly. So now a little bit of logistical talk on safety, protecting employees from continuing the risk of contracting the corona at work, and also handling the anxieties of those who are reluctant to come back. Again, you want to remove as much ambiguity as possible, establish protocols for safety and keeping the workplace safe, and follow those available federal and state guidelines. Consider establishing guidelines for the use of personal protective equipment like face masks and gloves. Have deep cleaning and sanitation protocols. Those will likely be needed. Consider whether changes to the layout of the workplace might make sense, like moving workstations farther apart or changing employee schedules to reduce the number of people in a building at one time. But establish some rules for governing when employees can return to work after recovering from an infection as well. Overall, clarify what those restrictions are, what the parameters are for returning and interacting with coworkers. Again, you want to provide as much clarity as possible, reduce ambiguity as much as possible, which is a great segue to talk about policies and procedures. Because with all of these changes and shifts, organizations really need to be certain to keep their policies updated. I cannot emphasize that enough, folks. I serve also as an expert HR witness for both for both defendant, for both, I can't think of the word for some reason right now, for a plaintiff, thank you, for plaintiff and defendant in employment law cases. And I cannot tell you the number of times that an organization's policies do not match their practices. And then that policy winds up as Exhibit A. So in every instance, it works to the company's detriment if your policies are not updated to reflect what your practices are. So without a doubt, those are important. So not only from a liability standpoint, but policies really provide a clear set of guidelines and instructions for how the organization operates. and how it functions. So they should provide clarity to employees on various aspects of their employment experience with the company. The policies really help to solidify or memorialize, I should say, organizational norms that underpin the culture and the performance, the ways of working, as well as those standards of behaviors and interactions. Those policies really help to create a common culture in a lot of ways, and it helps to generate some social cohesion and to build shared trust among your employees. So you'll want to communicate those policy changes broadly and proactively to ensure accessibility, that your employees have access to them. The policies need to be clear, unambiguous, because again, too much of that right now in the world right now. So avoid creating lengthy, overly complex policy documents. Instead, focus on succinct policies that have the policy statement and purpose and what directions the employees need to be aware of, but avoid embedding procedural elements in those documents wherever possible, because the procedures are so nuanced and contain so much detail that aren't essential for a policy statement. So keep the operational procedural elements separate to the degree that you can. That will also help with your agility in terms of being able to keep policies updated and quickly, because the longer, more complex policy that your policies are, the more time that it takes to update them, especially when you get into nuanced details about procedures. What department does this? How long does it take to turn this around? What department does that? When you list all of that in your policy documents, then you're inviting a very long, painful updating process for maintenance. Here's a list of the type of policies that might require your attention for updating. This list is by no means exhaustive, but it gives you a sense of the biggies. So attendance, sick leave, return to work, FMLA, unpaid leave, anti-racism and inclusive behavior, compensation related, so things like hazard pay, shift diff, bonus or incentive pay, structural elements, pay structures and payout intervals, overtime stipends. You really want to make sure that you are taking a look at how your compensation practices may be evolving over time, and make sure your policies get in lockstep with those. Equipment allowances, uniform allowances, conduct and discipline and termination. And in those areas, you really want to strike a balance between maintaining compliance and demonstrating compassion toward your employees, given the current circumstances. Employee mobility policies, so how employees move within your company via promotion and transfers, working from home policies. Are things changing in terms of allowing employees to work out of state, for example? If that does, your policy needs to reflect that. Performance evaluations, those may need to be adjusted, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of dates or goal setting or expectations, recognizing that in today's environment that so many employees are unable to meet some of those pre-established performance goals. So having, again, some compassion, some understanding in those areas, and then taking the opportunity to build in some accountabilities for diversity and inclusive behaviors, which I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Learning and development policies, layoff and furlough procedures, and then your rehire policies as well. So just also a general disclaimer on this slide, the slashes that you see in between those policy topics don't indicate that the topics should be combined. That's not a suggestion to say they should be. Some could, certainly, others not so much. But just so you know, that's not a suggestion to combine all of those topics into one policy document. So let's move on now from policies and talk about diversity and inclusion. Many organizations we know are re-examining their D&I programs and considering potentially rolling back commitments to those D&I programs or initiatives, particularly as a cost containment measure or a cost savings measure, that leaders are weighing as they're making decisions around hiring freezes and furloughs and layoffs and other ways to combat the economic fallout from the pandemic. So the simple one word of advice is don't. Don't abandon those communities, or excuse me, those commitments by believing that those efforts, excuse me, that those efforts of creating a more diverse workforce, a more inclusive workforce is tied to funding. By keeping D&I front of mind, you can begin to integrate it into other activities that occur during the normal course of the talent life cycle. So things that you have to do anyway, but that can positively impact the diversity of your workforce. So you can improve that diversity and foster a culture of creativity without and inclusion without throwing money at the issues. Now, of course, if you have the budget to fund certain initiatives, do that, but recognize that there are some very real and meaningful ways that you can improve in this area without breaking the bank. And just a side note that belonging, I just recently read this in the 2019 belonging report that's produced by Better Up. And that link is included in the resources section of the slide deck as well. But that belonging leads to a 56% increase in performance, 50% reduction in turnover risk, and 75% decrease in sick days. So there are absolute tangible advantages to employees working in a place that they actually feel welcomed and included. There are some practical and effective diversity and inclusion strategies that you can start to work on now, especially as you're going about the business of welcoming employees back and updating your policies and procedures. Those include, well, it starts with the data. Starting with your data to determine what's your workforce makeup. Pay attention particularly to your diversity numbers. Where are you lacking representation? Where are there pay gaps or inequities? There's a social responsibility, a social expectation for equity. And moreover, for employees to be their best, most productive selves, they need to not be distracted and demoralized by pay inequities. So conduct a pay analysis, correct any disparities found when reviewing things like race and age and gender or sexual orientation. Review all of your talent processes throughout your company to identify where there may be biases, and then develop solutions to correct those biases. You also want to continue or create or contract inclusion and equity training, depending on what your resources allow for. But the 3 C's, as I like to call them, continue, create, or contract. But either way, bottom line being, keep it going. Particularly now, there is a great opportunity before us. So encourage employees to engage in honest dialogue, facilitate group discussions if that is needed. But you want to overall as well provide staff with resources in the forms of opportunities and support to break through barriers through some tailored programs, mentorship opportunities, stretch assignments, reskilling with purpose. Meet people where they are and provide them with some opportunities for success. And be transparent. Whatever you're doing, whatever you decide to do, be transparent and inclusive about those efforts. Bring people along on the journey with you so that it's not viewed as something that's being done to them, but rather with them. Help people to really embrace their power of change that they have as individuals and collectively as members of your organization. You want to also recommit or create new policy or procedures that reflect inclusive behavior and that clearly state racism, discrimination, or inappropriate conduct won't be tolerated. And then take immediate action or corrective action if or when violations occur. Emphasize your organizational culture and your branding and help managers to understand the link between diversity and inclusion and business outcomes. You can also build accountabilities into performance evaluations for leaders in terms of their role in helping to create and retain a diverse workforce, as well as accountability measures for employees to demonstrate inclusive behaviors. Avoid doing things that are just at the surface level for aesthetics or just something that looks good on a piece of paper. You know, we've all seen that on the strategic plan document that is gorgeous. It's a masterpiece and it's useless. Nobody knows what it says. Nobody remembers the objectives. Nobody is, let alone people actually working on them to move the needle. So don't make gestures in this space under D&I. Don't make gestures or tiny little placeholders in the place of actual and real change. Reskilling, training, leadership development, bring D&I into the focus on that. You may be realizing that the skills that you need within your workforce aren't present to thrive in present day or within a virtual or even a hybrid model if you have that. So reskilling may be a priority. If so, leverage those reskilling needs because that really offers a golden opportunity to improve your diversity by providing opportunities to more diverse populations into underrepresented jobs. So as you examine what additional skills are needed for the workforce, also examine what learning and development opportunities have been provided to employees on the topic of diversity and inclusion. And then make D&I part of the talent life cycle, which is a whole nother webinar. I mean, well, more than an hour it would even take to cover that, but it's a great topic. One of the keys to D&I is to, if not the key, is to build it into the talent life cycle. Make it part of how you do business. So for example, if you're addressing return to work policies or updating your training and learning and development initiatives, integrate D&I focused activities into those areas. Bring D&I into focus when you're performing those, again, those established typical activities that are necessary to keep your business running effectively. So now we're going to move on to the kind of common themes. But before we do that, let me just leave you, before we move on from the salient points of these three big areas we just covered, let me just leave you with this, that in order to truly begin deconstructing the systems of racism, we must be willing to address the historic policies and practices that have facilitated the marginalization and the underrepresentation of Blacks and other minority groups. In an employment context, it starts within your organization. We need to recognize and embrace our power, your power, to contribute to improving the lives of your employees and your stakeholders, consumers, and the communities in which they live and work. So don't lose this watershed moment for D&I by focusing on the simultaneous pressures of COVID pandemic and racial tensions and the economic downturn. We have to, yes, focus on those things, but not at the expense of embracing this opportunity to make real change again and real progress in our personal and professional lives. Okay, common threads, know them to leverage them. As I mentioned early on, there are some common themes and threads throughout each of these areas that, when identified, can help advance all three, while not exhausting yourself or your resources any more than you already are. The themes that are indicated throughout this PowerPoint presentation, they are indicated throughout the PowerPoint by being highlighted in green. So the words that you see throughout this PowerPoint that are highlighted in green are those activities that cross all three areas of managing the return to work, updating policies and procedures, prioritizing diversity. So the objective is to view these from an end-to-end perspective so that these common threads cut across, allowing you to identify the multiple touch points that require active engagement, thus eliminating potential for oversight or redundancy for those pieces of work. So data, that is one of those common threads. It's a common starting point, as we just talked about. The data it informs where your action should be focused. For example, if you're determining which groups of employees to bring back to work and when, identifying parity and pay gaps, you need data for that as well. Estimating your policy impacts and implications of those. So when you go for your first, when you go for your data pull on this area, you know that you're going to need something from all these areas. Knowing that up front may help your data people with running queries right the first time. It may save you time and of course, again, help you inform your decisions. Communications is another one. It's present and necessary in all areas. It is a thread that runs throughout. So view it on a continuum. What do employees need to know about returning to work? What changes to policies and procedures do they need to know? What diversity initiatives or enhanced practices do they need to know about? Because communication and transparency from leaders continue to be exceedingly important. So it helps to instill trust. And those who communicate more drive a higher level of trust. So communications, they are even more important than ever before. So you want to examine your topics, perhaps for the month or for the week or for the quarter. What are the things employees need to know about and when? What stakeholder groups are involved or that need to receive the message? The message may be slightly different depending on the audience. What do they need to know again and when? So how the story is being told is so important. Information can be overwhelming, emotional, emotion provoking and triggering, especially when we know people are already under a lot of stress and pressure already. It doesn't take much, folks, to just send somebody right over the old edge. So, or just put them in a place where now they're not really receiving the information in the spirit in which it was intended. So how the messages are conveyed are of significant importance. So storytelling is a method in which you can use to help be transparent, to be very conscious about how you're communicating. Consider using storytelling to convey that message. Bottom line being, you want to find a way to really connect with the employee. And I don't know about everyone else, but in my experience with communications, the story is going to get told one way or another. It's going to get told with or without you. So if you are in a position to be able to contribute to and influence communications, do it. Because otherwise, like I said, it gets told anyway, and then you're not even going to recognize the yourself or the business or the topic by the time it gets told, if you're not in the driver's seat of those communications. So I can't stress that enough, using communications as a strategic driver across all of those areas that we've covered. You may want to also avoid diluting the message by bombarding employees with uncoordinated communications. That's where that calendar comes in and is so important. And then create a master communication schedule or calendar so that you can help avoid bombarding people. Inspiring a shared vision is also essential throughout all of these areas. It's essential to merging divergent interests to help work toward common goals. This is particularly important when we keep in mind the varying individual reactions of people in response to the pandemic and how they manifest in the workplace. So you want to integrate all of what's going on in the business, whether it's pandemic driven or otherwise, to really help employees be clear about what you're doing and why, where you're going and why. Employee engagement is another factor that cuts across all areas. We need a mindset shift to the now, and that really requires that active engagement because we simply just can't return to the old way of doing things, right? No matter how much we may want to, because we're just so far beyond that now, and yet we're not quite where we want to be or need to be. But we're somewhere in the middle, but we're far from where we were. and we've been awakened to see the possibilities of a better world to live in and to work in. And those possibilities have been illuminated for us, albeit in not the most pleasant of ways, but we've come too far again to go back. So it's critical that we move forward. So when you're examining employee engagement, understand the impact that these pandemics have had on engagement, and recognize that in all of these areas, employee engagement needs to underlie the focus of the work and the effort. Training, learning, and development, I think we've covered that sufficiently on the other slides in terms of how that translates into all of the different areas. And policies, similar to communications, identify where policy implications are for each area, and then create a comprehensive plan and a schedule to update them. Employee mental health is last but certainly not least, and similar to employee engagement, it runs all throughout everything that you do in today's environment. So keep employee mental health as a priority when you're engaging in any activity that impacts the workplace and the employment experience. I believe that's the last discussion slide that I have. The next few slides here are just resources for you. This will, as I understand it, be posted to the Local First YouTube channel, I believe, and likely all made available to you all. So here are a few slides on resources that you can check out and find additional information or help. That is it. If there are questions, I would love to hear them and do my best to answer them.
Perfect. So right now we do have one in the chat box. So if you guys have any other questions, just make sure to drop them in there. But I'll go ahead and ask this first question. So this is from Abby. And Abby says, how do you develop policies for your business that align and or are not in conflict from city-state mandates? For instance, can I require masks even if there isn't a statewide mandate?
Well, that's a very good question. I believe that, it depends under what state your business is registered. I know only in an anecdotal sense the answer to that question based on some of the big box stores that we've seen require masks. So places like Walmart, for example, Trader Joe's even, that require masks in all of their locations, regardless of what the state guidelines are. So yeah, Abby, I don't know beyond anecdotally. I think that it may depend on where your company is licensed. But I did include a couple of links in those resources slides to state and federal guidelines. So I suspect that you'd be able to find some guidance in there.
She says, thank you.
You're welcome.
All
and
right.
Hello. I know you, Abby. Hi, thank you for coming.
So yes, and also Tim sends his apologies for interrupting. So
public shaming works. We know it now.
You are fine, Tim. It happens pretty much with every presentation. There's gonna be one.
Yes, I was just giving you a hard time. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, so unless anybody has any other questions, you can also feel free to just unmute yourself. If you are not a quick typer, sometimes it's just easier to unmute yourself real quick if you have a question. But if I don't hear anybody pop in, I believe we can just go ahead and end the presentation. It was really fantastic. Thank you so much, LaQuaya.
Oh, you are most welcome. Happy to do it.
Yeah, I'm actually looking forward to, I'm going to send this to some of my coworkers because I really enjoyed your presentation. So thank you so much.
Good. I'm glad you did. Yeah, thank you. And again, thank you everybody for coming and for your participation. Best of luck to you. My contact information is on that slide. If you just have a question or just want to bounce a concept or something off of me, I am happy to do that. So just shoot me an email and I'd be happy to chat with you.
Perfect. And just as a reminder, this will be posted on our YouTube channel and then linked back on our webinar page. So you should be able to see that within a few days if you'd like to share it with your friends and colleagues. All right. Awesome. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.